There are, I'm going to try not to trip over this cable, but I encourage you to know that the church has insurance if I do trip over the cable, so it'll be okay. I might just be in crutches for a while. There are these things that psychologists or counselors or people who work in the mental health profession would refer to as flash bulb memories or strong foundational memories. And they're really just memories that are so imprinted on the back of our mind that we just cannot forget them. And I've used this as an introduction before in sermons. They are memories that are so ingrained for whatever reason in our mind that no matter what we do, we'll always remember them. A great example is asking people of a certain generation what they were doing when JFK was shot. I asked that to my second grade teacher growing up, and she remembered exactly where she was and exactly what she was doing, down to the type of bread she had on her sandwich and what was on the sandwich and what was on the TV and what was in her kitchen and the clothes she was wearing, because all of those details were caught up into that big moment. Likewise, you could fast forward a few generations, we'll say, and you could ask someone my age what they were doing on 9/11, and they remember instantly. Just bringing it up, you don't have to even close your eyes. You can already remember where you were and what you were doing when that happened. And these flashbulb memories tend to come about when something significant happens in someone's life, or someone's life is caught up in the context of an historical event, like a presidential assassination or a terrorist attack or other parts of history. You could go back to World War II and ask soldiers, where were you on D-Day? And they'll remember instantly. But beyond the context of history, we all personally form these memories on our own behalf when other important things happen in our life. I have one very strong one myself that taught me a little bit about this fear and worry stuff we were sharing with the children. I've shared this with a handful of you before, but when I was growing up, we grew up in the small town of Belton, and it was much smaller then when we lived there. And we lived in a little house outside of Belton, down by the river on a hill, and beside our house was this giant cedar tree, and you couldn't, as an adult, couldn't wrap your hands around the trunk. It was one of those really big old cedar trees. And we had a funnel cloud come through one night, and our family had taken shelter in the bathroom, the inmost room of the house, and we'd been crouched in there for a while. And so finally we decided it must have passed. We should be safe even though it's still storming. So let's get up, let's go stretch our legs. And my mom marched us as children out of the bathroom and down the hallway. And she wanted to inspire in us the awe and beauty of nature. So she took us into the laundry room, just old, regular single-pane windows. And we could see that big cedar tree centered on those windows, on the side of the house, on the side of that hill, in that giant storm. And she wanted us to be inspired. So she took us and stood us in front of the window and said, look at the storm and what it's doing. Look how violently it's making the trees sway. And the moment she said that, a big gust of wind came and caught that cedar tree, and it started to crash down towards us in the house. It was a flashbulb memory because I remember as clear as day being terrified that I would be crushed by this giant cedar tree as all three of us scrambled to run out of the laundry room, kind of engaging that fight or flight thought. Really, for me, it's the second of those two options. And nothing bad happened. It just fell onto our carport and just kind of fell and leaned against it. So there was no real major damage other than a little bit of damage to the shingles. But it was terrifying. It was one of those memories that just never leaves you. Close your eyes and you can instantly transport yourself back to that moment. But the other thing that I remember and I'm so impressed by was after we had that tree cleared. And now the trunk was about this wide. But when we went to clear the tree, they came and the workers came and they cleared all of the roots and everything. And when it was gone, we went and we walked down to the side of the hill and we looked, and there was a hole where the roots had been, several feet in diameter. It would have made a decent pond. Could have stocked it with some fish and had a good time. And I remember being a little child and being so impressed, because I never would have guessed, looking at that big tall tree up in the air, how deep and how wide and how expansive the roots of it were. Or the fact that the roots were what held it in place. The roots were its foundation upon which it stood. And that's what Paul gets at here as he talks about the church here in the 3rd chapter. Specifically verse 17 I lift up as he's speaking, and this is actually a prayer. Last week we talked about chapter 2 in Ephesus, and Paul was resolving the fight that had broken out between the Jews and the Gentiles, these two different groups of people, and how God had reconciled them. And really, to sum up Paul really quickly, he said, you all just need to get your act together. You're all children of God. But going on in chapter 3, he closes chapter 3 not by continuing to drive home his theological point or reprimanding the people who are being bad in the church, but he closes this chapter by offering a prayer on their behalf, and I honestly believe on our behalf as well, thousands of years later, highlighting the reality of God. And in verse 17, he highlights one of the realities where God's Spirit intersects with ours, and he says this: I ask that Christ will live in your hearts through faith, as a result of having strong roots in love. I think when I hear the word roots of that giant hole that tree left, and how big and wide, how deep and expansive the system was, how strong of a foundation that tree had, and how strong of a foundation we as people of faith must have if we claim to follow Jesus Christ. Paul prays on our behalf, encouraging and hopeful for us that we would have such roots in the love and the grace of Jesus Christ that we would be like that tree, that if we were to be upended, you could see we would leave a gaping hole in the ground of this world because our foundation and our roots were so deep and so expansive in the faith. It should be something that is so foundational to our identity. This idea of being rooted in love and in grace that Paul talks about, that when people ask us who we are, it should be one of the first things we think of. Who are you? I'm one rooted in the faith. I'm one rooted in the grace. I'm one rooted in the love of Jesus Christ. And oftentimes, that's not the case. Oftentimes we forget that, because oftentimes we are caught up by the fear and anxiety that the world presents. I mean, I don't have to sell anyone here that the world is changing. We've literally made a 15-page document as a leadership group that says that to a very large extent. But even beyond that, look at the world around us and how quickly it is changing. Look at our own community. There were buildings that were boarded up just months ago that are now open. There are things happening. There are roads that were once really smooth, but now if you drive too fast over them, you'll get a flat tire. But even beyond that, there are bigger changes. Our culture is changing at a rapid pace. I came out of seminary about 8 years ago. even though it looks like I just got out of high school a couple years ago. And it is astonishing to me that the world they trained us ministers to go into almost a decade ago doesn't exist anymore. It was a world where there was cultural pressure for people to go to church. People went to church because it was the right thing to do. That doesn't happen anymore. We were trained for a world and a day and an age in the life and history of the church that doesn't exist anymore. And I don't have to sell you on the fact that that culture has moved on from a Christian age to something after. And for better or for worse, that culture continues to change. And I will be the first one to admit, when I see that change, it gives me a moment of pause and fear and anxiety. What's going to happen to the church? What's going to happen to people of faith? What's going to happen to our traditions and our way of life? Likewise, you can look and you can see that we are facing the biggest communications transition that we have seen in the last 600 years. And I'm not overselling that. That's not typical pastoral hyperbole in a sermon. That is just plain fact. Not since the printing press was created have we seen such a transition of how and when people communicate. And when they made the printing press, they made a point of burning the first few ones because they were so scared of it. Just a great example is 2 weeks ago for our children's time, if you'll remember, we talked about telephones. And I shared with the children how I vaguely remember these things called party lines. And a bunch of you laughed when I mentioned that. But I do remember very firmly how great of an upgrade it was to go from a corded phone to a cordless phone. Now I didn't have to stand at that random podium in the hallway with the house phone. I could now take the house phone with me where I wanted to go. And a lot of you remember that. That was a big upgrade. And then some of you remember how life-changing it was to get caller ID, because the one person you don't want to talk to, now you can tell that is them calling. You don't have to answer the phone. And it's hard to imagine how earth-shattering those things felt now when we talk on smartphones that make the original cell phones look like ancient technology. In the span of less than 10 years, we've gone from everyone using landlines and cheap flip phones to everyone carrying computers in their pockets. We are facing an age of communication transition and technological advancement that we cannot even begin yet to comprehend fully. And that, like the cultural change, leaves us with anxiety and fear. We look at that and wonder, what's next? What's the next big thing? There's stock folks that look at that and really want to know what the next big thing is because they want to jump on that train. But that leaves us full of that anxiety and fear about the future. And then we look at the political spectrum around us. Regardless of the side you fall on, it's full of chaos and strife and fighting. We see changes happening that haven't happened in generations, and we wonder the same thing that we wonder about communications and about culture. What's happening? What does the future hold? There's no way to know what's going to happen next, and it fills us with fear. All of these kind of things on a huge human level fill us with anxiety and fear as we look at the world around us. It's like that storm blowing against that cedar tree. And the hope and prayer of Paul and myself is that our roots in the love and the grace of Jesus Christ are down deep enough that they've fanned out far enough that as the storm of the world blows around us, we would remain. That we would carry on as faithful disciples. And I honestly think, through God's grace, we will. We often think of the world as a much smaller place, or a much larger place than it really is. It's actually really small. It's something that's not nearly as big as we imagine. In fact, going back to when I was growing up, I remember being 4 and my dad plopped me in the front seat of our car, back when you could put kids in the front seat. And we went out to breakfast one Saturday morning to the little McDonald's on I-35 in Belton. And I'd never really been outside of the Temple Belton area. In fact, I hadn't even conceptualized a world outside of Temple Belton. And my dad had put me in the car. He was going to take me to go do a small job on a Saturday morning. He was a mechanic, and he had a customer that wanted him to come look at a truck somewhere in the far-off land of Killeen. For those of you who don't know your Central Texas geography, Killeen is 15 minutes from Belton. But 4-year-old me did not conceptualize this, and I had a small existential crisis in the front seat of that Trans Am, because I didn't understand that there was more world. I was sitting there holding my little fork with a pancake and my little cup of orange juice, the little ones they give you at McDonald's, and I couldn't comprehend what was on the other side of town. There was something past the other side of town? Really? You mean there's not just like a cliff and we're going to drive off the end of it into the ocean? But there's more? There's even more? And I was in awe. For about as much awe and about as long as that can hold a 4-year-old's attention. And I'm amazed because it's the same way people act when we talk about God. We let all of this change and all these things happen like a storm, berating us and beating us, and we don't ever stop to think that our God, the one who spoke all things into creation, our God who sustains all life, is bigger than the things we fear. In fact, Paul drives this point home in this prayer, and it's the whole reason I lifted this up. It's also the whole reason why this passage was the chief text for our master plan. It's not a mistake that we revealed that today and we're preaching about this passage. But he says in verse 20, "Glory to God, who is able to do far beyond all that we could ask or imagine by his power at work within us." We are faced with unprecedented changes in our culture, in our communications, in our way of life. And we let them fill us with fear. But Paul says to us this morning, we serve a God who is bigger than we can imagine or think of. And he can do more through us rooted in faith than we can imagine or we can think of. And if that is the case, what do we have to fear? What is it that drives our worry? For our God is bigger than those things. Our God is larger than the changes happening in our culture. Our God is bigger than the new technology. There won't be another Facebook or Snapchat that's bigger than God. He's bigger than the politics that drive the divisive nature of our day. Our God is bigger than the changes that happen all around us. And I want you to understand, because I know some of you sit there and you think, well, you don't understand. The Christian world's passing away. All these things are changing. The way we do life is changing. That's terrifying. But I want you to understand that Paul speaks these words in the same context that we live in today. As Paul writes this letter to the church at Ephesus, they're going through the same cultural transitions that we're going through today. The Jewish influence is waning and fading in his region. And in fact, it's being replaced by a Hellenistic, a Roman influence in the culture. Their whole political paradigm has shifted and changed in the last couple generations. Through the influx of Roman influence, they have changed how they communicate and when they communicate. All of the things that we are experiencing that we think are unprecedented, that we think should drive fear and anxiety and worry are in fact things that Paul relates to very well. And it's from these same places that Paul says to us today, your God is so big. You cannot imagine. You cannot think of what he can do. So I invite you as we begin a journey of transformation, as we live our faith into a new day and a new age that's full of challenges and difference and new things, remember that our God is bigger than we can imagine. He's so much larger than we can think of. And through his Son, Jesus Christ, as we go out into this world, he bids us to come and put on his yoke, as Christ said to his disciples, take my yoke, take my load, because the burden's light. Oh, there might be fear and change and all sorts of things, but the burden is light because our God is so big, and the help is plentiful. So go this day with the yoke of Christ, knowing that you serve an incredibly big God. Go this day in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.